Good evening, everyone. If you could please take your seats. My name is Bruce Buchanan. I'm the director of the Business and Society program here at NYU Stern. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight for this most compelling panel. My role is merely to introduce our visitors and speakers and then sit down, which I think I could probably manage. The title of our panel, as you know, is Addressing Social Problems in a Polarized Time. I don't think there's any debate that our time is somewhat polarized, so you're all here because of that. We are most pleased that Peter Georgescu, the Chairman Emeritus of Young and Rubicam, is here to moderate the panel. We are so pleased that Belle Sawhill has come up from the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. to be part of this. And my own colleagues, Jonathan Haidt and Tansy Whalen, both from the Business and Society program, are here to be on the panel as well. So welcome to all of you. I think I turn over this point to Peter. Thank you for being here, and let's begin.
Thank you. Let us all. Okay. So, good evening, everybody. Welcome. Welcome. As Professor Buchanan said, my name is Peter Georgescu, and I'm delighted to be here. And I do think this is going to be a very special evening, importantly because we have some critical issues to discuss. And I'm just delighted to be here involved with the Business and Society program of Stern's Business School. This is an extraordinary organization that is badly needed in our society today, and at the end of our panel, I think we will all agree that there's an awful lot of work yet to be done. Now, yes, we will have an engaged conversation, as I think the four of us sitting in front of you will engage in that. And not only us, but you and us will also engage together later in the program during the Q&A. Now, the reason that I'm here tonight is because I happen to care a lot about these issues, and also because I happen to be a practicing capitalist, but also the kind of capitalist who knows in my bones and everything that I have studied that free enterprise capitalism can produce extraordinary prosperity and growth, just not this version that is being practiced today, shareholder primacy. That is not working very well. I'm also here because I have been also chairman CEO of a multinational corporation, and I served on 7 public company boards, and I have also written and speak about inequality of income, inequality of opportunity, particularly from the point of view of business and how business can help ameliorate this extraordinarily challenging situation. In fact, what I consider to be an existential challenge for America. Now, very quickly, in a little bit more depth to give you a sense of this formidable panel that you will be hearing from. And it starts at the far end with Belle Sawhill, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and she's also an author of a book, The Forgotten Americas, and an economic agenda for a divided nation is what her book is about. Then John Haidt, he's Stern Professor of Business and Society and author of The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Very Bad Ideas Can Set Up a Generation to Fail. And right next to me is my good friend, Tansy Whalen. She's a comrade in arms in many battles that we have fought together. He's Stern's clinical professor for business and society and director of NYU Stern's Center for Sustainable Business. Now, as advertised, we will talk about the societal issues, challenging issues, unfortunately, out of an overflowing basket of problems and challenges, essential problems and challenges confronting America. Listen, we all know we live in extraordinary times. And they're extraordinary in many ways because we live in a sense where our government is terribly dysfunctional and polarized, where government is no longer in the business of providing and implementing solutions. And in fact, I would say that government right now is more ready to exacerbate our problems than to solve them. And then we have the business as an institution, which is firmly committed to distribute the wealth and prosperity that free enterprise capitalism knows how to produce to primarily one stakeholder, and that's the shareholder, and very separate from society and the people who desperately need help in our nation. Now, from my perspective, the number one domestic challenge for us happens to be this just gross and desperate creation of a second America. We have created a second America, and this is a zip code America, which is generously distributed among the vast majority of our people, again, distributed all across every piece of geography in this country. And this is, of course, I'm talking about the have much to less in our society. And these folks cover about 70+% of our people. A separate America where about 60 or so % of US homes have to borrow money at the end of most months to put food on the table. And so the middle class America is economically not viable for growth. They're insolvent. And the upper middle class is barely hanging on. Then we have a vast portion of our education, which is in fact terrible. It's so bad, in fact, that our children rank at the bottom of the developed world today, which is truly tragic. And at the top of our economic pyramid rests about 20 or so % of us. We think life is as good as it gets, and we're working very hard to keep it that way. And we in business continue to value the shareholders as the only stakeholder worth considering. And the rest of the folks, importantly the employees, are destined to be marginalized, and their, in fact, share of the pie cut, as is, by the way, the amount of investments that are being made in R&D and in basic research. All of this in order for us to be able to generate about 90% of the operating dollars to go to the shareholders, and we want to make sure that it does so in a most cost-efficient, tax-efficient way. So, with that on that cheering note, I'll say that it's time for us to hear from the panels. And my first question is to ask each one of them, starting with Bell, to say, from your perspective, and there are different perspectives that you'll hear from the various speakers in their disciplines, to hear from you what you think is the burning issue that is in your mind that we, business and government, should address. So, Bell?
Sure. Thank you, Peter. I so agree with so much of what you've just said. But if I had to pick the one overriding problem that we face right now, I think it is our dysfunctional politics, our dysfunctional government. Because all of the other problems, and you've mentioned some of them, and I'll mention them as well, but most of them could be resolved or at least improved if government was doing what government should be doing. We can have our debates, right versus left, about policy, and what's the right approach to any particular problem. And I would welcome those debates. I happen to be sort of middle of the road myself. Time magazine once called me a radical centrist. But I have to tell you, it sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it? But I have to tell you, I've been moving a little left in recent years because I think the whole society has gone over to some somewhat darkish place. Anyway, the problems that government should be addressing are, as you just said, rising income inequality. I called it the forgotten Americans. You call it the second America. We're all talking about the same thing. We have had these major economic changes, trade and technology, which I think are overall good for the economy, but they leave a lot of people and a lot of communities in great distress. And economists have for years talked about, well, trade is good, technology is good, but it will be disruptive and it will harm certain people, and government should step in to compensate the losers. If there are benefits from trade and technology, there should be resources to do that. We have talked that, we have not done it. And even when we've done it very ineffectively. So we have now this voter frustration. Well, let me go on with, let me mention a couple more problems. You mentioned education. It's on my list as well. And like you, I've been really struck. And I wonder how many people really know how badly we score on these international tests. You know, it's not great in reading, but it's even worse in math and science. Right. And somehow or other, I think we just think because we're the United States of America and we've always been, you know, the leading country in the world, that we're going to continue to be preeminent. But we can't if we are not able to educate our children. And then they're coming into the workforce without the skills that they need. And we could come back to that. I think the immigration crisis is another big one. In 2013, there was a actual attempt to solve that problem, and a big compromise that involved a lot of prominent Republicans, by the way. And just in a few short years since then, everything has come crashing down, and we can't find any compromises, and we have made this issue an ideological and political issue. Well, I could go on. And, climate change. How could I have left that? Actually, that always usually goes at the top of my list. But Tansi will say much more about that. I mean, really, it's an existential threat, so it should be at the very top of the list. And I think that, you know, coming back to my radical centrism, I believe in markets. And I believe in the business community. And I think that markets are fine. They do a really good job of allocating resources efficiently. But a market economy doesn't create a good society. It doesn't create flourishing human beings. And so what we had in the 3 decades right after World War II was a partnership between business and government that worked. And we've lost that. I like the way Charles Lindblom, one of our leading political scientists, once put it. He said, markets are like the fingers on your hand. They're very nimble and flexible. Government is like the thumb. It's kind of clumsy and inflexible, but it's powerful. But you need both. You know, your hand is not going to work unless you have both fingers and thumb. So I'm in favor of, you know, a mixed economy in which we go back to having a partnership between business and government. Now, in terms of business's role, I could say a lot more, but I won't right now because I want to give the other panelists a chance here.
Thank you, Bill. John?
Thank you. So when I was hired here in 2011, the dean at the time, Peter Henry, said that he wanted Stern to be the place where the most important conversations of our day were being held. And so that's what we think we're doing in the Business and Society program, and I particularly want to thank Bell and Peter for coming in and allowing us to have this conversation with you today. If I had to pick one thing, I guess I'd pick Bell's and make it government, but that's been done, so I'll pick number 2, is fairness even more than inequality. And let me explain that. So I'm a social psychologist, and I study morality, moral emotions, and how left and right are divided by their morality and politics. And just this morning, I saw in the Financial Times this quote. I think, Peter, you were watching this panel too. Michael Milken had some group of billionaires talking about what to do. And as you know, there have been a bunch of billionaires writing essays about how, rising inequality. They're going to be pitchforks soon. And one of them, Alan Schwartz, said, "What's really coming is class warfare. Throughout centuries, what we've seen when the masses think the elites have too much, one of two things happen: legislation to redistribute the wealth, or revolution to distribute the property. Those are the two choices." And what I'd like to do is point out from the point of view of psychology that this is not true. People actually don't mind inequality. What they hate is unfair inequality. There was a major review by Paul Bloom, a developmental psychologist at Yale, looking at developmental psychology and other literature. And he says, here's a quote from his article in Nature: "Humans naturally favor fair distributions, not equal ones. And when fairness and equality clash, people prefer fair inequality over unfair equality." And she says, "Both psychological research and decisions by policymakers would benefit from more clearly distinguishing inequality from unfairness." Now here's how to think about that. Fairness is an absolutely universal foundation of morality. You will never find a society that doesn't care a lot about fairness. But we often mean different things by it. And there are two major psychological subtypes that you have to keep your eye on. They are distributive fairness and procedural fairness. Distributive fairness is about proportionality. It's really captured in the Hindu notion of karma, the idea that, well, the negative side is if you do the crime, you should do the time. And if you're not punished, the universe is out of whack, and we're all kind of upset until the universe rights itself. And on the positive side, if you work hard and play by the rules, you should get ahead, as Bill Clinton put it. And boy, is that a winning line, left and right, in this country and in most countries. So that's distributive fairness, a sense that the universe is somehow fair, and if you work hard, you will be rewarded. And American capitalism really delivered that for several decades, and since the 70s or 80s, much less so for most people, as Peter was saying. The second kind of, in particular, the stunning failure to punish individuals after the global financial crisis, the fact that nobody went to jail, was a huge setback for public perception of capitalism. If it's unable to have any sense of karma, then it loses its legitimacy. The second kind of fairness is procedural fairness, and there are two elements to it. First is how decisions are made. If we all have the sense that there's transparency, we understand the process, and the decision makers aren't biased, then if the decision is made against us, we're much more willing to accept it, if we have a sense that the process was fair. So that's the first piece, is how decisions are made. We have to have a sense that the system is fair. And secondly, the second piece of it is how people are treated along the way. And that's especially, do they have a sense that they're treated with dignity? And if the law treats people badly, if it roughs them up and they're cursed at or denied a hearing and they don't have a voice, they get really angry and the system loses legitimacy for them. So people have to have a sense that they're treated with dignity. And this brings me to, and so the way, when a company becomes a shareholder primacy, short-term focused company, they hire a bunch of MBAs to figure out ways to reduce labor costs. And people end up getting treated like cogs in the wheel. Anything you can do to minimize the amount that you spend on labor is a good thing for the shareholders. People feel that they're treated without dignity. Why should they give their all to this company if they're being treated in that way? This just brings me to just one related point. I talked about fairness as the main thing, but a big topic that's being talked about now, another moral emotion which is related, is contempt. So Arthur Brooks has a very important book out now called Love Your Enemies, and in it he goes with Arthur Schopenhauer's definition of contempt, that it is the unsullied conviction of the worthlessness of another. And it's the sense that you don't matter to me. You don't matter to me at all. I can make jokes about you. I can ignore you. I can laugh at you. And this is what's happening as we get increased inequality. So inequality matters in this sense, to the extent that it leads to contempt. It's really, really bad. And here I want to point out one of the most interesting things I read in the last few years on this, on meritocracy. There was a great article in the New York Times by Ivan Krastev in 2017 called The Rise and Fall of European Meritocracy. And he asks why the exam passing classes, the classes of people who do well on exams, why are they so hated now at a time when the complexity of the world says that we need them? And so this is just as much, or more so in Europe, where they have the sort of Brussels and the elite that go to the top schools are the bureaucrats. And he says, what makes meritocrats so unbearable to their critics is not so much their success, but their insistence that they have succeeded because they worked harder than the others, because they happen to be more qualified than others, and because they passed the tests that others failed. And so if you think about it, the old elite was a hereditary elite that had a sense of noblesse oblige. The old WASP order, whatever its faults, they did have a sense of service, a sense that they owe something back to society. As it became a meritocracy based on test taking, which is in part a measure of IQ and part test preparation, the pernicious thing is that the people who do well actually think they deserve to be on the top, and they therefore don't owe anything to anyone. And so the top, this 10 or 20% that Peter referred to, treats the bottom with contempt. So when Hillary Clinton said, basket of deplorables, those 3 words, I believe, changed the course of world history. Those 3 words drove many more people to Trump and drove many more people who were leaning to Trump to actually go vote. If you treat people with contempt, boy, are they going to hate you and do what they can to take you down. So to conclude my section here, my recommendation is that we need a version of capitalism that greatly increases fairness, decreases contempt, and increases dignity.
Well said. Tonsi?
Well, so Bell took us big picture in terms of public policy, and John took us to the personal. So I'm going to now take us to the corporate unit and sort of tackle this question from that perspective. So my background is, before I came to Stern to launch the Center for Sustainable Business, I ran Rainforest Alliance for 15 years, which works with 5,000 companies around the world in forestry, agriculture, and tourism. And so we were working to basically redesign how you produce bananas or run hotels or harvest wood in a way that actually provided for meaningful jobs and put food on the table for their families and also protected the environment. And in doing that, I saw that business does its business in a way that's really stupid most of the time, right? And it does that not because it necessarily wants to be stupid, but because it's been doing it that way for 100 years, and that's sort of the way in which it's always been done, and there's no incentive to change it. So as a result of how we've been doing our business, we have climate change, we have inequity, we have water scarcity, we have biodiversity loss, we have challenges with diversity and inclusion and unconscious bias, a whole series of issues that, again, go back to a business can no longer today, in my belief, do business in the old way and then fix it by having philanthropy and nice community relations over here in their little corporate social responsibility unit while they continue to pollute and treat people poorly over on this side. And we'll talk about this later, but a lot of information is showing us that actually, if you really do care only about the shareholder, that approach is actually not good for the shareholder either, right? So we'll talk about the financial bit. But I see things like business focusing on productivity. So if you look at, let's just take the banana industry as an example, right? So the traditional way that you grow bananas in this old paradigm is you're aiming for as much productivity as possible. And to do that, you need to put a lot of chemicals on the bananas. And so you do aerial spraying, you spray, you put the bananas in impregnated plastic, pesticide plastic bags. You dip the bananas, women with their hands, without gloves, by the way, into water with fungicide. And the blue plastic bags that come off the bananas just fall into the waterways along with the runoff from the aerial spraying. And then the workers with the aerial spraying are living right next door, so the spray is creating higher levels of cancer, and you have very challenging working conditions. So that was, until the 1980s, the modus operandi of all banana plantations, and they did quite well financially, right? Then there was all sorts of challenges and pushback around deforestation, around the chemical use, around union and labor questions. And so suddenly things that could be done in the dark, were now exposed to the light. And actually we're seeing that more and more with social media, right? The transparency that's happening. What happened is we started to work with Chiquita, which is the old United Fruit, right? The taking over government company, and they began to implement a whole redesign of how you grow bananas. That we brought in all multiple stakeholders, which is a big theme of Peter's, right? So we brought in environmentalists, union workers, local communities, the business, government, to redesign how you grow bananas in a way that would be profitable, improve productivity, but also take care of the workers, ensure that there was positive environmental benefits, and so on. And so what happened? Well, instead of aerial spraying, you have little spot spraying. Instead of baths of fungicide, you just spray on the stalk, which is where the fungus comes in. Instead of just dropping those bags into the water, you collect them and recycle them. And instead of a chemical defoliant along the waterways, you actually grow a grass that provides amphibian habitat and reduces soil erosion. And you no longer have the impact on the workers in terms of the chemical use, or on the environment. And actually Chiquita worked out a huge union agreement where the workers are now paid very well and have good housing and all that. Long story short, 27% increase in productivity, 12% reduction in cost, got big contracts around the world where they couldn't get them before. Totally shifted how they grew bananas to think about it in a very, very different way, taking what they had done for 100 years and transforming it. And so from my perspective, the big societal challenge is for all of our industries, no matter which ones, to really redesign and make themselves fit for purpose for today's world in a way that provides people with meaningful jobs, reduces the inequity, and also protects our environment for the future.
Wow. I just feel compelled to tell you that I've given a bunch of lectures at other lesser business schools around the country. And I'll tell you what really turns me on about this evening, because I think this program that we are celebrating here tonight is a breath of fresh air. Because I think it's very incumbent about business school, the role that you guys play. And all of you who are studying and thinking about these issues, we need centers, we need some institutions that can hold a lantern for society, for influentials, for government, for the rest of business to say, hey, here's where we should be going. I'm just thrilled about this. As a question that came out of what all the three of you have chatted about, and maybe a way to frame the question, John talked about, actually, my close friend, Alan Schwartz, who is the chappie at the Millikan Center, who did not quote fairly Will and Ariel Durant, who wrote the quote about redistributing poverty or redistributing wealth. They said, in fact, and Alan, in the spirit of the moment, forgot to say, when inequality gets too large, this is what happens, the consequence. We're all unequal, we'll always be unequal, so obviously we're right. The thing so I just wanted to defend, because he also said something very important. The only business leader that I have heard so far to say inclusive prosperity and growth is the solution. And he said that, and John rightly said that, and that's obviously part of the answer. But you also said, John, you also talked about accountability, and Belle was talking about, she said, I believe in markets. So I wanted to just ask anybody in the panel who would like to respond to this question. What the hell is the market? Who can define to me what the market is? Because from my non-studious perspective, it seems to me that the markets are not free, first of all. That's a lot of malarkey that they say free enterprise is free, or free market capital. No. Well, it isn't free per se. We have governance issues. So I'd like to put it to the panel to say, I'd like to hear your definition of what the markets is, what kind of governance is number one today, and what are we looking for? What kind of rules are we, because the markets we know are not free. At least that's the contention. I'd love to have anybody in the panel.
If I could just first take a little riff on your point about business schools. My son is a business school professor.
Awesome.
He now teaches at the Washington University in St. Louis, but he's moving this fall to Berkeley, to the Haas School. And
yes,
the reason I'm telling you this story is not because I'm proud of my son, although I am.
You should be.
But because they said to him that they wanted him to develop some new courses on business social responsibility. And the reason they wanted him to do that is because students and the world around us is beginning to demand this. And
yes.
I'm sure you have that here, but I found it fascinating that that's happening, and that's hopeful. And the younger generation that is going through business school, who's going to be exposed to these kinds of ideas and debates, I think that's going to be really important for the long run. So I just wanted to say that.
No, I think that's very important, but I think, unfortunately, it's relatively new. You see, and of course, Berkeley being Berkeley, and your son's having been to one of the great higher education institution ever in, the University of Washington in St. Louis. But you're absolutely right. There are some, they're beginning, but that's just a little bit, we're just behind the crisis that we need, and we celebrate and cheer on anybody in any school that does that. You're already doing it. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, and I should just add that, it's not all about warm and fuzzy stuff.
No.
Tansi made the point that there's been this tendency to have this, unit over here, the corporate philanthropy or whatever, and the PR and the marketing that sounds like it's very much in the public interest or addresses some social need, and that's not been integrated into the business model itself.
That's right.
And so one of my son's analytic interests is whether or not marketing with PR about why you're a socially responsible business works or not.
Great. Back to the markets.
Back to the markets. Well, one thing, if you've ever read or listened to Michael Sandel at Harvard,
oh, yes.
He makes a lot of interesting points about where do we draw the line. Prostitution is a market. I don't think it should be a market. So, there are issues where there should be markets and where there shouldn't be, and then there are issues where maybe there should be markets, but they should have guardrails. They should have some regulation. I think the big issue is financial markets. And the fact that we had the financial crisis in 2008, nobody predicted it. Even Alan Greenspan says that he was caught sleeping. Janet Yellen, is one of my colleagues at Brookings, is now saying we could easily have another one because we haven't figured out what to do about financial regulation. We haven't even figured out what causes financial crises, much less what to do about it. So, we could go on and on, but I do think that it is very interesting that financialization, as some writers like to call it, has really taken off in this country. The industrial classification that they call FIRE, finance, insurance, real estate, I think I got them all, has gone from being, maybe some of you know this statistic, something like 5% to closer to 50% of the economy. And the profits that are coming out of the financial sector have grown enormously, Now, you have to have some story about why this sector is much more necessary or much more productive than it used to be. And, I have a very simple-minded understanding of finance. It's about taking people's savings and finding ways to invest them productively, and you need intermediaries to do that. And those intermediaries provide a value add. But why that value add should have grown 10 times or whatever it is, I'm exaggerating a little bit, I think, but the numbers are easy to look up, is a big question mark.
Thank you. John?
So I think that the question about markets is exactly the right question to put before us. Our panelist is about, as we're polarized and paralyzed politically, can business step in? Beforehand, we were all talking about how business can change the way it thinks and does and acts, and that's a big piece of it. But the place where businesses act is the markets, and here at Stern, all of our students have to take a course on professional responsibility, and at the heart of that course, the beginning of that course, we always start with markets, and we talk about 4 features of efficient markets. So if there's no monopoly, no major information asymmetry, no unregulated or exploited public goods, and no externalities or external costs imposed on others who are not party to the market transaction. When markets are like that, there just aren't a lot of really bad ethical issues. Of course, they're always possible, but those markets tend not to be the things that are the case studies in the rest of the course. And almost all the case studies, a lot of them are in finance and pharma. Places, sometimes it's because government steps in a clumsy way and ends up introducing inefficiencies into the market. Now there are all kinds of opportunities to make money, a lot of money, not by making other people better off, but by some sort of arbitrage, by taking advantage of something, by imposing an external cost elsewhere. So regulated markets turn out to be beautiful things. I didn't know that before I moved to a business school in 2011. But boy, as I taught this course and learned more about business, well-functioning markets are beautiful things. They create prosperity. They don't impose costs on others. So I think we do need to be talking about that. And just one little shorthand, a great phrase that I learned from a philosopher that we brought into the Business and Society program one day, David Schmitz. He said, a free market society at its best is a game that you can only win by making other people better off. I mean, you look at it that way, it's so simple. And of course, most businesses do make money because they make other people better off. But until we're at 100% in this country, as long as there are fringes where people can make money by harming others, then capitalism has problems.
Great.
So 2 thoughts. One quickly and really reinforces what you both said is that markets can be a force for positive change. I mean, you can use markets to scale up positive benefits to society, to the environment, to the world, and that is the ideal. But I also see, and I think this is one of the areas where we really need to address, is how, and to build on your point, Belle, around the financial system. So it's fascinating right now. We have these 2 different trends if you look at finance. One is activist, short-termism, shareholder primacy, strip and flip, approach, and the other is environmental, social, and governance, investing, impact investing approach. And they're both operating, so it gives you it's just crazy because they're both operating and pulling at the same exact time. So to give you an example of sort of the negative impact of this kind of markets that are so focused on financial engineering, I think the Hostess example is really fascinating. So Hostess went into bankruptcy. PE firm purchased it for $186 million. They created $2.3 billion out of that $186 million investment. The way they did that is they took on $1.3 billion worth of debt. They pocketed $900 million of that debt for themselves, not putting it back into the company or into the people. They also got $400 million worth of tax incentives, which went out over 10 to 15 years, long past when they were going to sell the company, that they got to keep even when they no longer had the company. So the company didn't get any of those tax benefits of having the jobs and being in those areas. So they ended up also, there was 8,000 employees. They reduced it to 1,200. Because it was in bankruptcy, they didn't pay pensions or anything out to anybody that they let go. They deunionized as much as possible. They put no money into R&D. So like, who wants to buy Hostess anyway, right? So there's the challenge right there. Do you really?
Oh, the company.
No, I meant the Twinkies.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
I like. Do you like the Twinkies? Yuck. Anyway, so.
Wait a minute.
Anyway, my point in all this is, I take this case to my students and I have them debate it. And if Hostess were a company not being purchased by PE, everything that they did, the students could argue against. But because it was a PE firm that bought it, and a PE firm is supposed to be only about making as much profits as possible and isn't supposed to care about anything related to anything else, they were challenged to make the case that this PE firm should not be doing this, because after all, they're supposed to be making the profits for their for the hedge fund shareholders, right? So that's a huge challenge, and we need to really shift that focus on financial engineering and the belief that it's okay to make profits if you're in finance in a way that you're not allowed to make them if you're in a typical corporation.
You know, I wanted to just make one point, because it was alluded to here and there. There's some good news around this very kind of troubled times that we're in. And there are many corporations that do good things.
Absolutely.
And I think we need to acknowledge them. They're few, they're the basis maybe for future change that they can be accelerated. But the culture is wrong, and the fundamental direction right now clearly suggests that things are broken. Now, the one thing that I wanted to say in defense of the PE is when I was CEO, we went through both an MBO and an IPO. And we worked with a firm on the West Coast. I'll mention their names, Hellman and Friedman. And I got to tell you, I spent 3 years with them. They were on my board. And they lived not only to the spirit, to the letter of their agreements, but to the spirit of their agreements. It was a terrific experience. Unfortunately, that's the exception and not the rule. The rule is increasingly more the Hostess situation. Now, I wanted to throw to the panel a very practical question. The gig economy is a big deal. We now have seen 2 extraordinary IPOs in Uber and Lyft. It is now predicted, so Goldman Sachs said, that next year 50% of American workers, about 82 million, okay, are going to be in this contingent version, meaning contract, unemployed, you come to work when I need you, etc. The problem is twofold. The job by job employed, not contingent, is about 18% less in the contingent areas, and of course there are no benefits. That's 50% of America's workers. What are we going to do about that? Panel?
I am not as sympathetic as some people to the idea that we should regulate this industry and provide or mandate lots of benefits. Let me take the case of healthcare. For historical reasons in this country, employers tend to cover healthcare. You get your benefits, most people do, through your employer. That makes American employers less competitive globally than those in Europe, where healthcare is covered by the government. So I think if you have the right kind of social insurance systems, providing some of the basic benefits, you don't need to have them placed on business, and that will be good for our competitiveness, and it will also not lock people into a particular firm because that firm happens to have better benefits than another one. I actually have been doing some work recently on paid family and medical leave. And what we are seeing in the high-tech industry now is a huge embracing of this, because they're trying to recruit professional, especially women, to come to the companies. But there's kind of like a scramble now. And I'd rather just see that provided through government and then have the competition be over wages. I mean, that's just to be provocative. Yeah.
I have a point of view, but I would let the other folks in the panel comment first.
Yeah, so I'm no expert I can't really comment on the gig economy per se. I'll just say that we have to be careful about saying we had these several decades when we look back and say, oh, those were the good days. And of course, everybody's income was rising at the same time. There's some good things about it, very, very good things about it. It's probably not recoverable. We probably can't ever get back there. And so the idea that employment is evolving and maybe it's going in a gig direction, I think that could be very good. Like many of you, I talk to Uber drivers sometimes, and the flexibility, the idea that people can do, yeah. So as far as I can tell, the idea of the gig economy is not a bad idea. I just saw some number that on average they end up making $10 an hour. So that's not enough. So I don't know how it can be, what forces would drive wages up. You can't be unions, I don't know what it is. But if it could produce a living wage, then I think it would be fine. As long as it's voluntary and people aren't doing it out of desperation, I think it's good.
Okay. Marcy?
Well, I think a couple of thoughts. First of all, I think we need some form of portable benefits, right, that people can have wherever they go. Because what happens with this, not only on the medical care front, but you now have to fund your own retirement, you have to fund your own vacation, you have to fund your own time off to take care of your sick parent or your sick child. So there's a whole host of, you're basically as an employer moving your risk off of you onto the balance sheet of the person who can least afford to do it. So I think that's morally wrong, and I think if that is the direction where we're going, then we need to figure out how we support people to be able to have a quality of life that is fair, but going to your point, because that is unfair, right?
That's right.
I guess the other thought that I have is that we have this myth it's become a myth. From the beginning, commerce was partially about job creation, right?
Yeah.
And even when we had the tax cuts, it was all in the language of this is going to create jobs or provide higher, salary increases to people. And yet the reality of it is that, and this goes to your point, Peter, about short-termism, shareholder primacy, et cetera, your goal as a CEO, if you're doing what's expected of you, is to increase your margins as much as possible, and your labor costs are your biggest cost. So you want to outsource it, offshore it, automate it, do everything you can to move it off your books, right? And move all that risk and all that off your books. So, my question is, how do we not necessarily go back, but how do we redesign what the corporation is for, and think about the fact that indeed the corporation is and always has been about creating good jobs for people, quality jobs, good jobs, and that it isn't the job of the corporation to get rid of as many jobs as possible to make as much money just for the shareholders as possible. So to support your point. So I think that these are a series of questions that actually need to be discussed out in the open, because there's all these assumptions that we're assuming that business creates jobs. All the tax breaks that the companies get because they're going to create jobs, when the reality of it is they're being incented really to get rid of jobs, right? So there's just this mythology out there that we really need to address and figure out as a society. What is business's role to create jobs, and if so, how do we do it better?
Well, I think you'll provide another problem about the answer as well, which is great. I wanted to just mention one thing. I happen to be vice chair of a large hospital here in the city. And part of the challenge with government doing it is that government too often does it very badly. For example, Medicare, Medicaid provide about 80% of the cost, not fully loaded, just the cost for the medical profession, meaning hospitals, for example. If that were the case, if we only have, in this political, as you know, you're hearing it all along, let's have Medicare for all. There will be no hospital in America that will be solvent. We'll all be bankrupt. Without the commercial part of the insurance business, we'll be toast. But I just want to make that comment out there. I want to sneak in, we just have about 3 or 4 more minutes before we turn it over to the folks. Sneak in a quick question. I think Bell mentioned predictions that people failed, the big a lot at the top in the Fed failed to anticipate and recognize the problem being created. What about measurements, the issue? do we have the right measurements today to measure the strength of our economy? I hear our president saying that we have the strongest economy in the world and stuff is terrific and everybody's doing great. Do we have the right measurements?
Well, this is another huge topic, but I think really the way I think about the measurement question is when somebody says, oh, GDP grew by 3.2% in the last quarter, isn't that wonderful? Well, we don't know if it's wonderful or not because we don't know who it went to. So, you know, the size of the economy tells you nothing about whether it's an inclusive economy. And as we all know, I think, most of the gains we've had slower growth in recent decades than we did in our earlier history, but whatever growth we've had has gone overwhelmingly to people at the top. And so that's a problem. You know, I do want to go back a little bit to some things that have already come up that I just wanted to comment on. One is going back to what happens when you treat your workers well. I have, as an economist, came into this area, onto this topic when I started working on it in my book with no expertise, and I thought, well, surely if you are doing good things for your workers, if you're paying them more or giving them benefits or whatever you're doing, it's going to be a trade-off with your profitability. And I have just been surprised by the amount of evidence, good evidence that's out there that that's not true. I'll give you my favorite example. This was a randomized control trial of fast food franchises. You should teach this one if you don't already. Maybe you know it. And in the treatment group, the employer or the manager of the franchise shared whatever profits with the workers, and they knew that. And the other one, they just got a straight wage. Who do you think was more profitable? There was no trade-off with profitability. There was, in fact, an increased profits. And so there's a lot of evidence of this sort. Larry Summers, an economic historian, did a wonderful study of when Henry Ford raised his wages back in, I think it was 1930. And what happened to productivity at the Ford Motor Company? It went way up. And that was totally unexpected.
And people had more money to buy his cars. Well,
it was partly that, but it was more that they were able to recruit much better people, and they worked harder. And they thought, when I did focus groups with the so-called forgotten Americans, which is your 70% who don't have college degrees and so forth, they told me over and over again how resentful they were. It was what John talked about earlier, that they are not being treated with respect. You know, not only have they not gotten raises for a long time, many of them, but they'd say things like, well, at least somebody could give you a piece of paper at the end of the year saying you did a good job and make you feel like you're a member of the team, not just a cog in the machine. So, I could go on and on about this.
Okay. Well, I think going on, we need to go on to you.
Yeah.
So please, there's a gentleman there.
Sure.
Just one second.
Microphone.
Steve McCarthy, Stern 79. I've been coaching and mentoring the social entrepreneurship program here for the last 15 years, so near and dear to my heart. 2 points. One, on Tesla. The amount of people that are pushing back at J.P. Morgan, Voya, Wellington, think about the ESG. What's coming, the reckoning, is the fiduciary responsibility on the part of the money management business to hold corporations' feet to the fire. And that's growing very dramatically and aggressively. So that was one point. And then on John's point, fair inequality. I asked this question whenever I get a chance in front of venture capitalists. I said, let me ask the question, because they talk a lot about disruption, innovation, things like that. I said, who's responsible for the disruptees? In other words, we can talk about the different part of the education pyramid and the fact that we have problems at the low end, but think about the 40, 50, 60-year-olds that get out of jobs, get waylaid. How do you get them back in the industry? How do you get them back to reposition? And how does that affect the lost generation, the 70% that don't have the degrees of that? Maybe there's a public-private partnership where you go to the venture capitalists and other people and say, wait a minute, let's have some fair inequality here. Put aside some money for retraining for a great portion of the people that are disenfranchised. That's a critical issue, I think. I'm
Okay.
just curious.
So, Chauncey first.
Okay. Just very briefly on the ESG front, there's really good studies out there. One is by Arabesque and Oxford looking at 200 academic studies where they found pretty much 80% agreement that good ESG performance correlates with lower cost of capital, with better operational performance and better stock performance. And our own research with the methodology we call ROSI, Return on Sustainability Investment, is also finding very concrete financial benefit to companies employing sustainable practices. In one, we're looking at the automotive sector, and one company has seen 3.7% EBIT annually related to their sustainability strategies. So yes, I see ESG investing and sustainability as being actually the way you demonstrate your fiduciary responsibility and duty.
Okay. John?
Oh, I have nothing to add.
Okay. Yes, we have. And
Good evening. My name is Ron Pinto. I graduated in 2008. Thank you. This has been, I cannot even describe it. I have a question for you, and of course I'd love to hear from you as well. You mentioned about two potential scenarios down the road, right? One being insurrection, let's call it for what it is, and distribution property by force, I imagine at that point. And the other one, legislation, which would lead to income or wealth redistribution, right? Are there any examples out there in other countries in the world where that's actually, the latter has happened and has taken place successfully, let's call it? It's hard to measure that. Has that happened, number one? And then the other thing is, I'm not talking the Scandinavian example that everybody loves and talks about. I think that has a history of evolution and it kind of did on its own, right? I don't think we can replicate that. But is there a history of a country that faced the challenges that we're facing today, where we know there is this income inequality, and steps were taken to remedy that?
Roman Empire, sorry.
That's a very good question. I spent last week in Argentina. I was invited down. The Argentine government is bringing down a bunch of academics who can advise them on how to get better economic policies and political policies, especially with the constant threat of populism and bad economic policies. And the sense in Argentina of just being in a trap, that they just can't get it right. Now, Chile, obviously, and you look at the graphs, Argentina for a while was as wealthy as the United States. It was one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Right. Chile was way below them. So Chile, in a sense, got it right in terms of economic prosperity and efficiency. I don't know about the equality or inequality in Chile, but there is certainly a sense of being in a trap in many Latin American countries, that they're just having trouble breaking out. We do have plenty of examples of countries that have gone from undeveloped to developed. Obviously, well, the Scandinavian countries, but many of the Eastern, Singapore, other countries. If you're asking, to at least get the dynamism and the prosperity, there are plenty of examples of that. If you're asking about, are there any that had high inequality and then addressed it in modern times, that I don't know. There are factors that are pushing for higher inequality everywhere. It's happening more in the U.S. Robert Frank, a wonderful economist at Cornell, wrote a book, I think it was a book called, where he wrote something about winner-take-all economies. In the 80s, he was talking about this. Before the internet, he was observing that technology is allowing Michael Jackson to collect a huge percent of the money that was spent on music, and most musicians make very little. And then we get the internet, which just ramps it up far more. So I don't know, does anyone know about countries that in the last 30 years have been able to substantially reduce inequality while still rising in prosperity?
Germany.
Germany's done, they've reduced inequality.
Correct.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dramatically.
Yeah. Okay, and what's the key? Is it putting workers on? Is it giving workers more right? How do you do it?
Well, they have a very interesting system that it goes all the way from education, that build trade schools. From trade schools, they're great jobs that are people can pick a lot about. Not everybody needs either a doctorate or even a liberal arts college degree. You have two paths to success, one through the normal university, the other one's through a form of liberal arts, plus a trade schools that you graduate with a degree in a certificate that gets you a job, almost guaranteed jobs in the industry. And the educators and business work together to make sure that their certificates go to where the labor need exists. So yeah, it's a whole Megillah, but it works. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Steve Brant. I was actually a student here in the early 1980s. Eventually, I stumbled on the Dr. W. Edward Deming's work.
Oh.
So his management philosophy of
my
a whole
professors.
systems approach.
Can you closer?
Sorry, his whole systems approach really appealed to me because I actually have an engineering background, so design thinking, systems thinking. And I mention that because I'm looking at the market question. What does the public know it can have? And what Deming taught was that cooperation can give us a world. He actually did a lecture. He said everyone could win. We would have a world of not winners and losers, but everyone could win through cooperation. And I got involved in corporate social responsibility, and it was never visible to the public. And this whole issue of marketing is what I'd really like you to answer. How can we, because I think it's critical, that the public should learn it has the option for an economics of socially responsible values, not just the shareholders are be all and end all. I don't know why Business for Social Responsibility or even the UN Global Compact hasn't gone public. It's never in the New York Times. They have annual conferences, you never hear about it unless you're there. And so this issue of what does the public know it can have, that's boggled my mind for a long time. There's a book, Blue Ocean Strategy, written by the INSEAD professors. There's got to be a breakthrough in letting the public know what they can have. They're angry and they want to kill people, but if they knew they could have this better world through social responsibility, through what the UN Global Compact and others propose, I think they would force the transformation as consumers, but they don't know they can force it because they don't know they can have it.
Okay. Any comments anybody would like?
I wish we had
John?
some of the panel in advertising.
Yeah, well,
You're the
perhaps.
advertiser.
Yeah, no, go, Chauncey, please.
Well, it's just
I'll comment later.
And you should definitely comment, Peter. We just finished a first of its kind in more than 15 years study of consumer purchasing, of consumer packaged goods. So all of the data that people cite say there's an intent to buy sustainably, but then actually they don't actually do it, right? But what we found in working with IRI that collects all of the data whenever you go into a supermarket, they get the barcode of everything you buy. So we looked at 3 years of that data across 40 different consumer packaged goods categories. That's from, toilet paper to deodorant, right? 773,000 SKUs. We looked at every single one. We found that over the last 5 years, the percentage of sustainability marketed products grew 50%, okay? Which is amazing. And so we're now, the actual percentage in total is about 17% is sustainability marketed products. But when you look at the different categories, some of them have 150 to 100% growth. And a lot of categories actually would have negative, like milk, would have had a deficit if it hadn't been for their sustainability marketed parts. Also, in addition, when we go back to ESG investing, these numbers are suspect, okay? But the latest US CIF report came out saying 1 in every $4 in this country is now in some form of ESG investing. That's way overstated, but what is right is that because they've been tracking it this way, the same way for the last 8 years, every 2 years, it's been growing at 50% every 2 years, okay? So even if the number is half that, the growth is really significant. So that's just one smart, little bit of cheery note that I would put forward, and I'm happy to talk later about campaigns and how to go about that, because that's, yeah.
I would just like to add one thing. I started to work, I was in the research part of Young Rubicam once, and Deming had his cubicle right next to me before he went to Japan. So we had some interesting chats on the subject. But one of the things that I think I want to say that it's important for you folks to work on and connect with media to a larger degree than we are right now. Media has, I don't want to say has failed us, but it's following the wrong things. If you turn on the television, look at the print, you know what you see. Primarily every single day is the same subject. And that's an unfortunate thing. And we need to capture the attention of media on this thing. And that's important. It's incumbent for all of us, people like myself, capitalists who really believe in this, and I think in you folks who can shed light on it. And we need to do more of that, because that's really important. That drives progress. Back there, whomever, who's got the
People over
microphone?
there have been
I just
raising
want to
their
make
hand a
sure
lot.
too, there's.
Yeah.
Okay, hello. Thank you so much. My name is Kyrie. I am just a regular guy. I didn't graduate from NYU. I went to a small, I went to a small black college in the Midwest, Wilberforce. Graduated in 2008, and then I have a sociology background. And I'm also one of that basket of deplorables that you guys mentioned earlier, even though I have this skin color. So with that said, I know that, excuse me. So I know that you guys were talking about the whole, especially you, Mr. Haidt, who I especially admire. We're talking about the difference between inequality and unfairness. So my question is, how would we address that in most communities of color that have had a history of a major wealth gap due to many, many things, even though we have actually had a history of having wealth and then losing it and then gaining it back again and then now losing it again, and that's here where we are. When we put it in the hands of the government, I am in full agreement that the government sucks at just about everything. So instead of having them do it directly, is there some type of way that we can maybe incentivize these communities and put the power back into the hands of the people? Because I can tell you right now, I live basically in the hood in Staten Island, and even when I go down to the bodega, it's not even really the bodega, it's people who run these corner stores who do not look like me. They're not from here, and the people who they answer to look like them. They own those buildings, whereas black folks do not own those buildings. The black dollar stays in our community for 6 minutes, whereas the dollar for Caucasians can stay in y'all's community for up to 60 days. For Asians, it can stay in y'all's community for up to 30 days, 28 days. Black people, we can't live black because we own nothing. So how do we build that wealth so that we can get on that parity, so we can be on that level playing field?
So I think communities learn from experience, and those learnings can either incentivize kids to have certain dreams and expectations, or it can discourage them. I just finally, last week, started reading the Ta-Nehisi Coates article on reparations, and he goes into the history in Chicago, the lending market for housing in Chicago, and the incredible predatory awfulness of it. And so if the black experience in America has long been, I mean, even after slavery and Jim Crow, once all that ends, you still have predatory lending, predatory housing markets. What lesson does that teach? You can imagine that black kids are not going to grow up to be entrepreneurs in the same way that, say, Jewish or Korean kids who, their uncles or whatever it is. So I think this country has a special obligation, a really special obligation, to look at the financial lives of African Americans and make damn sure that they're not being exploited. And so I think, I don't know a lot about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, but that sort of thing I think is absolutely vital. I think on this panel we all agree, and in the business society we generally have a very positive view of business as long as it has high standards, as long as it's run well. It is the engine of wealth creation, it is the road to the middle class, and so if African Americans have been just repeatedly pushed down and discouraged from it, that is a national tragedy, and that's, I think, where we need to focus a lot of attention, both regulatory and business outreach. I was just talking with the CEO of AT&T, and they said that each of their regional companies have an ESG project, and a couple of them were focusing on basically trying to prepare black kids for careers in business. So I think business really can step in. I don't know how scalable that is, but that's a pretty big company that at least is trying in some areas.
Okay. Anybody else on the panel? I'm sorry, folks. Anybody else has a very brief comment on this? This is an important issue. So, Tonsi, Bell?
Well, I would maybe build a little bit on, this does not get at the wealth gap, but I think it gets at this issue of too many people now think that the only route to upward mobility is to go to a 4-year college and study sociology, okay? Nothing wrong with sociology, but I mean that there are too many people who are not given an opportunity to get a skill that is very valuable in the labor market. And I'm worried about, I've seen programs, Peter mentioned some of them earlier, where there's partnerships between businesses and community colleges or training institutes that are having great success, including with, minority young people. And I'm not, we have this hang up in our country that we don't want in any way to track people. We don't want to say, well, whites should go to four-year colleges and minorities should go to community colleges. So I want to be very careful and clear about that. On the other hand, not every white person nor every person of color is really going to gain the best they can from going to a four-year college. So we need more opportunities for kids of all colors to get that skill set that they need to be successful in today's labor market. I promise you that the rate of I won't promise you, I predict that the rate of return on a four-year college degree is beginning to flatten out right now, and it's going to decline.
Okay. Now, unfortunately, some of us are going to hang around for a while, so get after us because we're going to talk to you. But I wanted, I'm going to summarize in 1 second because we just got a few minutes left. But I wanted to make, I think you brought up a very important question. And I think we have to look at it in the short term, and I think you heard some suggestions here that communities, colleges, and businesses must focus on the folks of color. It's a problem. It's a serious problem. There's been, unfortunately, a continuous level of exploitation. Increasingly more now, not only of people of color, but also poor white folks too. But the people of color have been exploited the longest period of time, and that's got to change. The key issue, I believe, the long-term solution is clearly education. And what I mean by education is not just trade schools. That's just fine. We got to start at age 3. Every child in America from age 3 on has got to have the beginning of cognitive development. If we don't do that, we're never going to really address long-term equality of opportunity, which is the real problem, is equality of opportunity. Income inequality drives inequality of opportunity. We really need to think about it in those terms. Education has got to be a major force, and that's where government and business must come together and figure out how do we begin to change the entire educational system for all Americans. If we want inclusive growth long term, we've got to have education for everybody. The American dream is possible. Now, I wanted to conclude by just a couple of comments. First of all, it's pretty clear that you've heard tonight that the current system is broken at just about every level. The government is obviously broken because the whole media attention is just telling us the dysfunctionality of the current system in spades. So that's pretty obvious. So the other point that I want to make is that we've gotten to that point of Will and Ariel Durant where this problem is so severe that the current system is just no longer sustainable. Change is going to happen. So we're either going to get some wise change or we're going to get some truly dumb possibilities to come in. And one of the things that I would like to suggest is that let's vote for the wise change. Because, look, at the end of the day, the right version of free enterprise capitalism, and you heard some already from Tanti and others, it works. Just what is the governance? What do we want business to do? At the end of the day, that's the question. Free enterprise will deliver that if we ask we as a society, we as government to reinforce it. So that's where the partnership between business and society really comes together. With government saying, we will reinforce it, we will regulate, we will have policy, we'll make sure that it happens, but business can, in fact, deliver. And I want to end by thanking very much Bell and what you folks are doing at Brookings is very important. I think your institutions and your organization make a big difference, and we need you very badly. And once again, I want to congratulate this program, the Business Society program at Stern's Business School. You are providing an extraordinary exemplar. We heard others that exist. And sure, there are a few here and there, but I think you play a very important role in helping frame the solutions and provide the kind of answers, and gives us encouragement, in essence, that the best days, if we do the right things that we know what to do, can still be ahead of us, and that the American dream doesn't have to be a forgotten thing in history books, but the American dream can be lived by all Americans, my friend, and that's where we must go. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you again.